right. Let's go ahead and kick off the afternoon session. My name is Dante Loretta, and I'll be chairing this afternoon. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Tanya Luhrmann. Tanya is the Albert Ray Lang Professor at Stanford University. She's a distinguished scholar in anthropology and psychology, and her groundbreaking work bridges these disciplines to explore how people perceive and engage with their worlds. She's written several books, including the acclaimed When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. Please join me in welcoming Professor Luhrmann.
Good afternoon. This is a very, let me just pull up my slide here. This is a very cool conference. All right. And now I need to find my mouse. Okay. The predicted disaster has happened. I can't find my mouse. Yeah, I have to get it back here. There we go. Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon. I'm an anthropologist, and I've always been fascinated by the way that our inner world or our consciousness is shaped by our social world. And I'm going to talk about that this afternoon by talking about a kind of weird phenomenon that I think gives us some profound insights into the nature of our experience of consciousness. And that's the experience of a voice, hearing a voice, the experience of being spoken to in the absence of a human speaker. And this is our rock star in the domain of voice hearing, the medieval peasant woman girl, Joan of Arc. So I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people about these experiences, and as I do that, the more complex they seem to become. But I think that they have, for the most part, three qualities. First of all, when somebody feels called in this way, they say that the experience didn't sound like them. They said the voice didn't have their it didn't have their own timbre, their voice timbre. It didn't have a quality of myness. They knew it was different. They also often say that there's something ambiguously located about the experience. People will say things like, I heard it audibly in my mind. I heard it outside of me, but not with my ears. There's something kind of betwixt and between about these events. And these events have intentions. They're like minds. They come from minds. They feel like they come from something that is thinking, that has purpose, that has intentions for you, that is directed at you. We are familiar with these experiences in the domain of psychosis. We use that term to describe some set of experiences that seem radically disconnected from reality, perceptions that seem askew, or thoughts that seem not connected to the world as we know it. Roughly 1 in 100 people meets criteria for a diagnosis we call schizophrenia. And when people, 60 to 80% of people with schizophrenia hear voices, and when they hear voices, the voices can speak out of their legs, they can swarm in from the next room. You can hear voices slough off of the car when the car drives by. People can experience themselves as living in a beehive of harassing sound. Often those voices are mean and negative and cruel. But in the non-clinical population, what we call the general population, roughly 3 to 10% of people hear voices when you show up with an NIH clipboard and you ask them questions. If you ask them differently, you can get the rate up to 70, 80% of somebody who's had some kind of auditory, quasi-auditory experience of being called from the outside. When I talk to evangelical Christians, roughly one in 3, a third of them will say they've had, at one point they have heard God speak in a way that has a hearing quality. And if you talk to people who've lost somebody dear to them, many, many of them will say that they've had some moment in which the person that they have lost has spoken to them, they have seen the person, they've felt the presence of the person. Roughly between 50 and 80% of people who have lost a spouse will say that they've felt them in the months after their death. These are odd experiences, but they really matter. They matter because they're evidence of spirit. So gods and spirits speak. That's how you know that they're there. Mary knew that she was carrying God because Gabriel spoke to her. Muhammad knew that what he was hearing was divine. He felt that the Gabriel was speaking to him. Abram knew that Yahweh was there because he heard Yahweh's voice. These experiences have mattered in history. Augustine became a Christian because he heard God speak to him. A friend of his, he wanted to be a Christian. He was torn. He felt that he was kind of torn against himself. There was something that was keeping him from converting. A friend came to talk to him about a desert father. Augustine was overwhelmed. He ran into the garden. He threw himself at the foot of a fig tree, and he heard God speak, and that enabled him to become the person that he was, and that changed the course of Christian history. Our rock star, Joan of Arc, felt so confident when she heard God speak to her that she was able to go to the King of France and persuade him to give her an army. And with that army, she won a battle which may have saved her kingdom. A little closer to hand, Martin Luther King Jr. was at the eve of the Montgomery bus boycotts. There were death threats against his family. He was thinking about stopping, calling off the protest. He sat at his kitchen table and he prayed, and he heard God say that he would be with him, and he went forward. Voices matter to more ordinary people as well. This next person is somebody that I met. She'd recently graduated from UC Santa Cruz, a very good school, and the best job she could get was the morning shift at 7-Eleven, and she didn't much like it. One morning, this woman came in, and she looked like she'd been up all night. She looked like it had been rough. She threw her stuff on the counter, 2 6-packs of Miller Lite, some cat food, and a food product of some sort, donuts, I think. And she looked at me and she said, "Hey, can you get me a carton of cigarettes?" And I'm thinking, excellent. This is what I want to be doing with my life. So I turned around, I rolled my eyes, and started thinking my judgmental thoughts. In that moment, I literally heard the voice of God say to me, "Do not judge this woman. I've created her in my image, and I love her." And poor woman, I almost fell over. I'm trying to give her change, and I'm like, whoa, the voice of God spoke to me. I have been changed ever since. So the scientists who work on this material pretty much agree that voices are thoughts that come to be experienced as not me and not inside. However you understand the ultimate source of the experience, whether you take these experiences to be coming from extant gods and spirits, it's my view that if God or spirit speaks, the God or spirit speaks through the nature of our consciousness. And I'm willing to agree that there's a mentalish event that comes to feel as if it's not entirely mentalish, as if it's more perceptual than that. Many people want to say that these experiences come out of something that's broken in the psyche, that they're all sort of a continuum of psychosis, that, you know, people who are really ill, we diagnose with a diagnostic category, and Martin Luther King Jr., he just had a little bit of what gets broken in the mind. I don't think that's true. I think there's something much more fundamental about the way that we feel our thought, about the way that we experience our consciousness, and that madness tweaks something about this basic process. I come to these questions for many years, studying religion and studying psychiatric conditions. The method of my work is slow, careful conversations. I sit with people, I talk to them, I want to hear their stories. And as they're talking to me, I'm trying to listen for things I have heard other people say. I'm always looking for the novel experience, something that nobody else has described to me before. But I'm also looking for the shape of their perceptual and non-perceptual experiences, trying to see if it resonates with other things that I have heard. So over the past few decades, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, some of them mad, many of them not, about these experiences. And I really want to talk to you about three things I've observed this afternoon. The first thing I see is in psychosis. Psychotic voices are pretty good candidates of thinking that these are bodily experiences. They're nothing more than the brain gone awry. But even these voices seem different in different social worlds. And so I want to talk to you briefly about the first study I've done in this domain, although I've done now a variety of these studies. And this is a study in which we compared people who met criteria for schizophrenia in the United States in San Mateo, in South India, in Chennai, and in Accra, in Ghana, in West Africa. And so I did this work with colleagues, and then I had Tamil colleagues talking to people in Tamil, and I worked with a Ghanaian psychiatrist, and then I went in and I re-interviewed people in English. I feel pretty confident about the pattern that I'm describing. And what I want to say is that in San Mateo, so we talked to 20 people in each place, and then since then many more people. In California, the voices people describe are often violent. They talk about, usually it's like torturing people, to take their eye out with a fork, to cut somebody's head off, to drink their blood, really nasty stuff. These are people who meet criteria for schizophrenia. Not one American in this first study described a dominant voice that was positive. In Chennai, over half the sample heard their kin. They heard their mother, they heard their father, they heard their sister. And they felt that often these people gave them annoying tasks. But they were parents. They liked having them around, more or less. When the voices of people with schizophrenia in this study were negative in Chennai, the negative voices spoke about sex. They told the voice, the person who was hearing the voice, would hear the voice talk to the room and say, they all know that you're masturbating. They all know what you do with your body at night. In Accra, half the sample heard God. Very robust. Most of the Americans were Christian. They didn't talk to me about hearing God as a dominant experience in their life. In Accra, people said things like that. They just tell me to do the right thing. If I hadn't had these voices, I would have been dead long ago. I want to hear in the echo of these experiences something about the different cultural invitations about the way people think about the experience of consciousness. There are many reasons to think that people with schizophrenia might hear violence in their voices in the United States. At least one of those reasons, I think, is that Americans are committed to such a sharp division between the stuff of the mind and the stuff of the body. And it is terrifying to think that there's something in your mind has gone broken, has gone awry. A dominant invitation in South Asia is the centrality of other people in your life, particularly if you were young. When you were South Asian, other people, particularly if you were young, should know what you should be thinking. In Accra, in Ghana, in West Africa, the thoughts of other people can be dangerous. You need somebody to protect you, and the supernatural is very close and immediate. The second thing I see in my work is that voices emerge from the way that people pay attention to their thought. I could give you many different examples of this. I'm going to talk to you about charismatic Christianity, a world in which people seek to have an intimate relationship with a God who speaks to speaks back. In a church like this, an evangelical, a new person in the church, but about a quarter of Americans used to go to these churches. The number's down a little bit recently. And if you come to a church like this, you've got to know, you've got to learn that your mind is not private, but God can speak into your mind and that you can talk to God. And so you have to learn how to pick out from your mind the presence of God in your thoughts. People say things like this. When people are praying over me and I'm just receiving it, all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas, where her mom lives. Because I had been debating whether to go to Kansas, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. The thought was spontaneous. It popped out at her. It was unexpected. It seemed to say the kind of thing that God would say. It was a good candidate for her to interpret it as the presence of God. In a church like this, you have to practice talking to God. You pray, and you pray, and you pray, and you pray in these informal, improvisational ways. And when you pray, you imagine God with your inner senses. You walk with God. You stand in his throne room, and you seek to feel the heat of his power on your cheeks. And you learn to talk to God as if he was there, even if you don't quite believe in it yet. Talk to God as if he's there, and you will come to feel that he's there, people say. After some months in a church like this, people say things like this. I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. This experience is not meant to be audible. There are hundreds of books that tell you how to do this, how to hear God speak to you. And most of them will tell you that this is not meant to be an auditory experience. But sometimes it is. Here's a woman who said, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like May or April, to start a school. And because I've heard these stories, I say, you heard this audibly? Yeah. Were you alone? Yeah, I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really. I was just thinking about God. And I heard start a school. I immediately got up, and it was like, okay, Lord, where? I think this suggests that there's a non-mad pathway to hearing voices. That as people pay attention to their inner mental events, that can lead to some mental events seeming to be more external and more in the world real. That's where we published some of that. In addition to the practice, there are two more things I want to say about learning to hear voices or things that facilitate the voice hearing experience in the non-clinical population, the general population. The first is absorption. So absorption is an experience of being caught up in your inner world and your inner imagination. I measure it with a scale developed by Auke Tellegen and one of his colleagues. Series of 34 statements, and the person looks at these statements and says, is this statement true of me? Sometimes I feel and experience things as I did as a child. Again and again and again, the more highly people score on the absorption scale, the more they're likely to report that they've heard voices, they've had visions, they've had a vivid experience of God, they've had an array of other spiritual experiences in which something mentalish feels as if it's not simply there in their mind. Here's the second piece of that story. If people have a culturally supported idea that thought is powerful, they're more likely to report these experiences. And we describe this set of ideas as porosity, the idea that there's a sort of permeable membrane between the mind and the world. I think it's deeply human to have conflicting intuitions about the way that thought works. I want to suggest that it's kind of a default model that most humans have a kind of bag with holes model about thought and the way we know things about the world. We have thought inside, and we have these holes in the bag. We have eyes, we have ears, we somehow get information from outside. And mostly thought is private. Nobody else knows what you're thinking. It's inside you. When you die, it's gone. You don't have a body, it disappears. And it doesn't do stuff. It doesn't leak out into the world to act on its own. But you know that that's not the way you experience your thought all the time. You have dreams. Those often feel as if they're not yours. Sometimes it feels as they bring you information from outside. If you get really angry at somebody, it can feel like power coming from inside with a direction and a kind of force. Many people have intuitions that after the body goes, something of the mind lingers on. And these ideas can be picked up by culture into ideas about cursing, ideas about praying, ideas about the power of thought. So recently, I did a project with these fine scholars in 5 different parts of the world. And we interviewed people of faith carefully, richly, openly. We did short face-to-face interviews with people on like the equivalent of the DMV line. We gave undergraduate surveys. And we found something quite remarkable. We found that no matter where we went in the world, and no matter how we asked the question, the more absorption an individual assented to, the more voices they reported, the more they were likely to say they'd had some unusual experience of spirit in which spirit spoke to them in a way that they could hear with their ears to some extent. And the more porosity, the more they assented to different kinds of cultural questions about how they thought about thought, the more they assented to questions about the power of the mind, the more they were likely to say that they'd heard a voice or had an array of other spiritual experiences. And there were striking differences across faiths and across cultures. There was something, these ideas seemed to, porosity was a cultural idea. It wasn't just a psychological trait. That's where we reported that, and I talk about it here. So I'm making the argument that there are 3 features for the non-clinical population that seem to facilitate these unusual experiences. There's some kind of proclivity to absorption, some ability to get caught up in your inner world, some interest in getting caught up in your inner world. There's some set of cultural ideas about the power of thought and the sort of the ability of thought to kind of interact with the world directly without the thinker, and some kind of practice, some iterative practice of paying attention to your inner thought. And I think there are 2 features of this practice that I can see. One of them is mental imagery cultivation, attending to all of the inner sensations in your mind. And the other is what's called suspension of disbelief, your willingness to talk to another an invisible being as if that invisible being was there. Let me go back to psychosis. The third thing I want to say to you about the third domain of this work that I want to share is that I think that we can see that training and practice may avert illness. In Ghana, in Cape Coast, there are spiritual experts called a kung fu who talk to the gods. You see advertisements like this when you drive along the road. This is a world of many gods, where you have the human expert who creates a relationship with a particular god, and maybe a relationship with another god and another god. And they have altars through which they communicate to these gods. And through the communication, they do favors for people who are not experts, who come to them for healing, for protection, for a variety of favors. People are called by the gods to become an expert. The god often calls when the person is in their late teens, often a time when somebody has their first psychotic episode if they're going to develop what we call schizophrenia. When somebody is called by the gods in Ghana, they look pretty crazy to their family. Their family has a story about the fact that they look crazy, and then their mother says, no. They've been called by the gods, I'm going to take them for training. When they go for training, they're apprenticed for a couple of years, and they're taught how to hear the good God speak, and how to ignore the demonic voices that they also sometimes hear around them. And then they develop a relationship with the gods. And people will say, if you are called by the gods and you don't get trained, you will go crazy. This is the team that worked in Ghana for 8 months. I went out and I joined them. They'd already interviewed a whole group of people, and I went out and I re-interviewed them. And there was and as part of this project, I spoke to 18 people who were talking to gods, and they said they'd heard God speak audibly once a week or more often, which is pretty unusual for the general population. We'd already talked to them at length. I re-interviewed them, and what I really wanted to know was what God's voice felt like, what it sounded like, how they knew that God had spoken. And so I talked, and at the end of our conversation, I played them a track that was designed by a woman called Pat Deegan, who meets criteria for schizophrenia, is also a psychologist, and she and her colleagues made a track that represents to them the experience of hearing voices for somebody with schizophrenia. And so I'm going to see if I can play this for you. I found my mouse. This is so exciting. This is 45 seconds. We translated this into Fante.
You are the one. I came for you. I came for you because you are the one. It's you. You are the one I came for. You
Stop it.
are the one. It's you. It's you I came for. It's you. It's you.
Look at their
and you have
eyes.
the way.
Look at them.
Their
I
eyes
came
are
for
full
you.
of disgust.
You have the way.
You smell. You are disgusting.
We know you.
They're looking at you and seeing you, and they see everything you do, and you are disgusting. Yes. Hey, stop it! Stop it now! Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
So I would play this track, and I would say, is this what the gods sound like to you? There were some people in this group that were just like, this is nuts. This is not my experience. This is a convocation of witches. Those people tended to hear God speak audibly more rarely. They tended to say that God was always kind to them. They tended to say that they rarely heard demons. But there was a core of people, maybe 6, a little hard to be certain, who said that that was the way that God sounded to them. They talked about hearing demons. They talked about hearing demons audibly, even many years after their initial training. And they said that their training had helped them to rein in the demons, to hear the good gods more clearly, and none of them had ever been hospitalized. That's where I published that. And I saw a similar story when I talked to spirit mediums in the United Kingdom. And so we spoke to about 25, and a number of people have done versions of this work. Talked to 25 folks who are practicing spirit mediums. Some people, they loved the idea of being spirit mediums. They kind of came across it in a bookstore. They decided to figure this out. They went for training. They started hearing the voices of the dead. Sometimes the voices were audible, sometimes they weren't, but they loved the experience. Other people, they had some they were hearing voices before they came across the concept of spirit mediumship. They bought a book, they got some training, and they said that the training had helped them to rein into the experience and helped them to experience the voices less negatively. And that's where you published that. So that's where I'll end. I want to suggest that this experience of hearing voices is not so weird, that something about your practice can help to rein it in. I think that probably most people in this room assume that practice affects consciousness. I think what I've been able to suggest this afternoon, that culture may affect the way that you experience your consciousness as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have lots of time for questions. The mic will come on. Can we get the audience mic?
Thank you very much for that talk. I've been looking forward to it for months. I'm a psychiatrist. My question relates to your work on social kindling, on the idea that cultural invitations modulate the qualitative experience of voice hearing in various contexts. And I'm wondering what you think the major opportunities and responsibilities are for psychiatrists and other people who work in mental health, both in the clinic and in wider culture, in regard to helping formulate new invitations that are less harmful or less contribute to negative qualitative experiences of these voices, and in particular how we do that while also being aware of some of the anxieties that psychiatrists have about issues like collusion.
Such a great question. So I think the simple thing to say is that there are increasingly new interventions that seem to use not pharmacological interventions, but social interventions, the hearing voices groups, cognitive behavioral therapy. Those, I think, are very useful for at least some people. I think that the less freaked out we could be when somebody first reports, when a particularly young person reports to a parent or an educator or a doctor that they're hearing voices, there's some thought that when a young person, Eleanor Longden has a fabulous TED talk about this, but when a young person goes to a psychiatrist and says that they're hearing voices, the doctor like sits up, pays attention, and suddenly is very worried about the person. If that could be modulated, that would be lovely. I think if we lived in a world in which schizophrenia didn't seem like a diagnosis of death, that would also be lovely. That's harder to pull off. I think that, in the most general sense, the sense that so many Americans have that their mind is everything and is a source of their identity is also highly costly. I don't know how to fix that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was a great presentation. I'm curious if you're familiar with the work of Julian Jaynes. It's on the origin of consciousness in the bicameral brain. This felt very resonant with that, where he kind of talks in the book about that maybe even in recorded history, we were kind of much more swayed by these voices, and that, quote unquote consciousness, as we sort of see it in modern society, is like a breakdown of that kind of engagement. I don't know, I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I love Julian Jaynes. He's a little batty. So as neuroscience, I am not a judge of his neuroscience. I do think that to me, the major insight was that the way that you think about your mind shapes the vividness of your inner voices. And so his observation that a lesser attention to the inwardness of experience leads people to experience some of those inner experiences as more external. I think that's true.
Cool, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I
you.
got a lot out of it. My question is, at first blush, it would seem to me that porosity and proclivity would exist in a dialectic relationship, and I'm wondering if you have come to see them as cleanly bounded, if you could say a little bit more about the delineations.
So, what a great question.
Thank you.
I'm still trying to figure that out. So we are about to publish a study in which we have enough subjects in the study to see a statistical interaction between the two of them. When we looked at our initial group of 500 people, we did not see a statistical interaction between those two phenomena. And the two absorbed in our small study, and I believe in our larger study, which we haven't quite finished with, absorption behaves more like a psychological trait. Tellegen thought that it was, one and done. You were, and some people think that that's true. It's singing to me. I think that, not mine. Maybe he has a question. I'm not whatever absorption, there's a deep question about absorption, dissociation, trance, hypnosis, how trainable those are. And probably, anyway, I don't know quite, I have many views about that. Absorption behaves like a trait, and porosity behaves like a cultural idea.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Chet Swanson. In 1998, I was in a cabin in Vermont with no contact with cell phones or payphones. And I got this strong feeling, and it went on and on and on. I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive. And this just kept going. And so I tried to find a payphone, and I couldn't find one. And the next morning, I called a friend, and she said, Michael's mother died last night. I had never met Michael's mother, but when she was in need of medical help, I donated money to get that medical help. Well, this went on for a couple days. It occurred to me, well, where did consciousness leave from when she was clearly conscious to the consciousness that overwhelmed me? And so we started figuring out, you know, flatline, we're not going anywhere from there, but bioenergy, electrons and protons, we could measure. And we have measured, and we find out there are readings after flatlining. Now, we don't know whether this is going, but it's certainly the case that a lot of research is needed in this area.
I fully agree. That's why I'm here.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Bruce Nappy. I have a question and sort of a follow-up. In psychology, there's this practice called lucid dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is really, you know, have you interviewed people who have lucid dreaming, you know, to see what they can say about it? But let me add one thing because it's related to the question. I have an additional ability which I call interventional lucid dreaming. So when a dream starts, I can actually enter the dream and talk to the person who I call the dream master, who's behind the curtain, you know, like on Wizard of Oz, and say, you know, I don't like this dream. Can you change it?
That's great.
Or, yeah, but, and I get a dialogue. And so to me, it's just, I don't know how many people would be out there that you could find that could actually ask you to, you know, give me a list of questions to ask, you know. And
So that's wonderful. I think that Justin is going to speak to that question. A group of people I could have talked about were people who create invisible friends called tulpamancers. Many of them come into that practice through lucid dreaming, in my experience. But I haven't really explored dreaming itself. It's a very cool phenomenon.
thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your work in, you know, characterizing this very important phenomenological experience. My question is, you know, here in the United States, when we encounter folks with, you know, dangerous command auditory hallucinations, often the solution or the reaction is to pursue involuntary commitment and medication. I was wondering if in any of you or your team's travels you found like societies where, you know, folks with dangerous command auditory hallucinations are managed other way, and whether this is effective or not.
So this is a great question. I think certainly psychiatric illness, so I'm certainly not of the school that says that the severity of schizophrenia is only due to the Western setting. I think serious psychotic disorder occurs everywhere. It looks kind of the same everywhere in its most flamboyant form. But there are different ways of handling it in different social worlds. Some of them can feel pretty appalling. So sometimes people are shackled to logs. At the same time, we know that outside, the best data come from India. you probably know this, the course and outcome of schizophrenia is kinder or more benign in India. There are a number of hypotheses that seem to, that people use to explain it. In many parts of the world, including India, when somebody falls ill, they do so within their family retains responsibility for them. They don't name the diagnosis, so the person is not particularly afraid of the disorder in the same way as happens in the United States. Sometimes they're in a joint family. Sometimes the disorder, the experiences can be understood as the voices of gods. And I think it's clear that the content of psychotic voices to some extent is malleable. And it is my belief that the local culture can help to sort of soften some of the harshness of the negative features of schizophrenia to some extent. It clearly does not erase them.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I relate a lot to this because in liminal states, when I was a child, I would practice them to hold them so that I could hear voices and other things, and I loved it. I thought it was great. I also have had people close to me who've had similar experiences, and they have perished because of psychosis. So something, I've referenced some of these papers a lot, and I find them really interesting, especially like the anthropological approach to understanding different cultural approaches to these experiences. And I'm wondering, when you say the different traditions in reining in the magical manifestation of some of these experiences, have you done any field work or research related to those specific traditions to see comparatively how people have regained balance in some of those scenarios?
So, I mean, so I've done this comparative work with schizophrenia. I think that it's clear that people who are very ill, typically their voices, and when they hear voices, typically those voices are meaner, louder, more audible, more frequent. And with people who aren't ill but seek to have the experience, their voices are kinder, more responsive, less frequent, often shorter. There are many people in the middle, and I think there are many pathways to get there. I think sleep, and being on the edge of sleep is one such pathway. Deliberate trance-like, dissociative, hypnotic-like practice is another way to get there. It's hard to find the Joan of Arcs. Mm-hmm. So I've talked to many people, but I haven't talked. But it's hard to find a kind of, a population of people who naturally have many frequent voices. If you know how I could reach such a population, I would love to talk to you.
Yeah, I'd love to exchange information.
Excellent.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you.
All right, last question. Hi, I love your talk. My name is John Mashour. I was a physicist training with Penrose and Oxford, and then I stayed in touch with them over the years as I was in Silicon Valley designing chips. Mm-hmm. But in recent years, I encountered an Irish mystic by the name of Luhrmann, who's a kind of hybrid example of what you've described, in that she heard voices that she interpreted as angels as a child, but they told her, don't keep your interactions with us secret because they'll lock you up, which would happen in Ireland when she was a child. So she kept her experiences secret. It was protected from having anyone cast judgment on them until her children grew up to be old enough to protect her from being locked up. Then she wrote a whole bunch of books about it.
I'd like to, yeah.
And the angels told her, once she started writing the books, they said, you really should be collaborating with scientists. And I think one of the reasons why I'm incredibly grateful for your talk is that it's clear from your experience that how we think about information we get from outside of our bodies very much influences our state of health, our well-being in receiving information from outside our bodies. And technology abandons us to just get it from gadgets. But the science of consciousness, the models we choose to entertain, allow us to consider porosity and absorption to be more benign processes. And Lorna has articulated a variation in the Penrose-Hameroff theories that describes an ability to get information from outside the body that is very benign. And I think your research leads me to hope that narrative is very powerful in helping to secure the well-being of people who otherwise might have gotten ill.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for that.
I mean, the simple thing to say is that these unusual experiences happen to many, many people, and they are not always mad. They're often beneficial, helpful, guiding, and they can give rise to great satisfaction.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we do have a lost cell phone up here. Maybe Susan from the last speaker. I will take it. If you lost your phone, find Dante. Okay, our next speaker is Justin Riddle. Justin is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. He studies the neural basis of cognitive control. If you haven't checked it out, he has an amazing YouTube channel with a whole series of lessons on the science of consciousness. I've been watching them and learning from them, so thank you, Justin, for putting those out there. And he also has been teaching remotely introductory science of consciousness class at the University of Arizona, where we have launched recently a minor in consciousness studies. And I also teach a class, my Life in the Cosmos astrobiology class is part of the the consciousness minor at U of A. So I'm excited to hear from Professor Riddle.
All right, happy to be here. Let me get my slides set up. All right. Thanks so much for the intro, Dante. I'm just really psyched to be here. Thank you, Stuart, Abby, the other organizers for organizing this super fun, amazing conference. They're just a bunch of amazing people. So yeah, joy to be here. Beyond my own introduction, I just want to preface by saying that the model that I'll be presenting to you today was kind of a collaborative effort between me and Jonathan Schooler, who is a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at UC Santa Barbara. So yeah, my talk is Hierarchical Consciousness, the Nested Observer Windows Model, and I think you'll find a lot of parallels to Tanya's recent talk. All right, so I'm going to emphasize kind of the curious state of our mind. So when driving, you start to mind wander, pondering the nature of consciousness. Without warning, you suddenly realize you're almost at your destination. You wonder where the time went. Now your attention is focused on navigating which freeway to get off and on what side street to turn. You are acutely aware of the lack of awareness paid to driving, but you do not notice that the wandering mind kept wandering while you were focused on navigating the side streets. When parking your car, you revisit the wandering mind. There's a fresh batch of theories and models that seem to have materialized. You diligently proceed to review those new ideas as you absent-mindedly walk up the driveway. So this is meant to sort of emphasize this kind of canonical experience we have of driving a car at 70 miles per hour and barely paying any attention to what we're doing and just kind of flowing with our thoughts and thinking abstractly. But kind of what we don't really consider intuitively is that why wouldn't it be the case that there's a wandering, abstract, cognitive part of your brain that is always mind wandering, always pondering abstract thoughts? And to what degree do we really have control over our own brains? And to what degree is there a lot of semi-autonomous cognitive processes kind of bubbling underneath the surface of our minds? So hierarchical consciousness is essentially reimagining or reconceptualizing some of these intuitions that we might take at face value. So one of them, which Tanya kind of summarized, is this idea that we naively think that our mind is a monologue. There's a single narrative self, thinking thoughts that we call us, that we call me. However, if you introspect on your experience, you'll find that you often have a lot of conflicting ideas, opinions, perceptions, beliefs. Sometimes we're paralyzed by indecision when faced with complex things that we have to do. We have identity with our thoughts. We say, I created this thought. This is my thought. I made this thought. It is mine. And yet other times, thoughts will emerge fully formed into our minds without any sort of apparent origin. And sometimes we think, oh, wow, I'm brilliant. I thought of this great thing, and it just happens to be there all of a sudden. And other times we'll have thoughts, and we'll go, oh, my God, that was not me thinking that. My brain just shot a thought into my mind, and I'm not responsible. Let's suppress that thought immediately. And we have this idea that we're in control of our bodies, we're moving around the world, making decisions, navigating the complex lives that we live. And yet, when you think about, the musculature of your body, when you make yourself do bodily movements, how aware are you of the complexity of all the musculature that's being activated? It appears that our minds operate at a very high abstract level, and these thoughts are being mapped down into the body. And so there's many instances where we can control our bodies, or sometimes control breaks down, and it's a more nuanced relationship that we have even with our own bodies and our own brains. So hierarchical consciousness is essentially suggesting that your mind is comprised of many cognitive systems internally, and more so, these cognitive systems might be nested within each other in some sort of recursive, multi-scalar way. So why would I think this? So a question we ask as neuroscientists is, where should we study consciousness? And so you say, we must study the brain. Okay, but where in the brain and at what level of brain should we be studying? And there's a bit of a reductive bias that we have in our modern culture where we think everything should be reducible to something smaller and smaller. So those people studying EEG and MRI like myself are just totally off the deep end studying these large macroscopic brain regions, but really they should be studying individual neurons and circuits of neurons, because that's where, the real action is taking place. But wait, you say, there are synapses that comprise the neuron, and without understanding synapses, how could we even talk about a neuron? And synapses are made of proteins, and proteins are made of atoms, and we can just infinitely reduce ourselves, and suddenly we're all particle physicists running to the nearest particle accelerator, and we've forgotten that we set out to understand consciousness in the human brain, right? So where does this reductive bias sort of fail? And status quo right now, and I think this is a bit of a historical context that we're within, is that consciousness is neurons, and neurons are consciousness, and the neural level is where we're going to understand consciousness the best. However, the hierarchical solution would say that all of these systems are important and meaningful, and potentially there is information processing occurring at many different scales within our brains and within our biology, and if there is some means of processing at each of these levels and then communicating information up and down across these different scales, then that would be sort of the most appropriate way to study consciousness. So you've heard a lot about neural oscillations at this conference, but I'll kind of just give you my shtick on it. So what are neural oscillations? Well, when we think about how does the brain function, I like to give the analogy of a train. So if there was a sort of brain train chugging along, moving your consciousness forward, what are the building blocks or the engine of that train? And we would intuitively say, it must be neurons. Neurons are the engine of the brain train. And when we look at their activity through time, we see neural spiking, these action potentials, where neurons are communicating and squirting chemicals at each other and then responding dynamically. But if we put a probe inside the brain and we measure, what is happening in these neural populations, we observe these large electrical fluctuations that occur at the scale of entire brain regions, right? These massive electrical fluctuations that encompass hundreds of thousands and millions of neurons. And the sort of traditional thought on these big electrical fluctuations is this is the steam off the brain train, and we can safely ignore this steam, and really neurons are the gold standard, the currency of communication, and these electrical fluctuations we can kind of safely ignore. However, there's been a lot of work the last 20 years or so really saying that the picture is a bit more complicated than it seems at first pass. So even though these electric fields might be generated by the mass action of many neurons activating collectively, once these electric fields are generated, they then constrain and change the electrical activity of individual neurons. And it seems like there's a bit of circular causation here, where even if these are emergent properties from the mass action of neurons, they then exist independently from the neurons individually and then influence neural activity in this sort of circular way. And there's since been a lot of interest kind of fleshing out, these dynamics at these different levels. So why be interested in neural oscillations? Well, it appears that neural oscillations are the closest correlate to human cognition that we have in the brain. So, for example, as I talk to you, there is a certain rate that I speak, and if you look across any language, despite cultures, if you analyze the patterns of acoustics that are coming out of my mouth right now, you'll find that there is a very prominent rhythmic structure to that sound activity that is conserved across cultures. And as I'm speaking to you, your auditory cortex, various regions in your brain are entraining to the words that I'm speaking. And if you're to measure from the brain, you can actually witness electrical fluctuations that are tracking with and predicting the acoustic information that I'm sending out into the world right now. So electrical activity tracks one-to-one very dynamically with a lot of the speed at which we are taking in information and potentially the rate at which we're thinking and processing information internally. Another example, the flicker fusion rate. If I flash two light bulbs at you quite quickly, or if I flash a light twice really quickly, at some point you're going to say, hey, that was just one flash, it wasn't two distinct flashes. And the rate at which you will go from perceiving two separate flashes to a single flash is called your flicker fusion rate, and this occurs roughly around 100 milliseconds. And the cool bit here is that if you record from the visual cortex, there's an electrical fluctuation called the alpha oscillation, and this fluctuating electrical rhythm is actually clocking the rate at which your visual perception is refreshing. And so if these two different flashes end up in different cycles of this electrical fluctuation, then you perceive two separate flashes, versus if they show up in a single cycle, you only perceive one flash, right? So these electrical fields seem to have a very direct relationship, not only to behavioral patterns, but also to visual perception. And there's many, many other examples here. So how do we know that these electric fields matter or are doing more than just kind of emerging from neural activity? Well, there's many techniques in cognitive neuroscience where we can stimulate people's brains while they're doing various tasks that require cognition to be occurring, and we can deliver stimulation to change these electric field patterns. One of them is rhythmic transcranial magnetic stimulation. You send brief magnetic pulses into the brain. This generates a brief electric current, and over repeated application of these pulses, you'll see an increase in electric field fluctuation according to the frequency at which you're delivering the stimulation. And this can change cognition in a very controllable, predictable manner. So this is essentially how we've built causal evidence that these electric field fluctuations at the scale of entire brain regions plays a critical role in cognition. And so the next question here is there some means of communicating across these very different scales? So introducing cross-frequency coupling. So cross-frequency coupling is essentially when you have a signal from a more macroscopic, large neural structure and a more microscopic, faster activity in a smaller neural structure. And there's a coupling or a relationship between the activity between these two different systems. This was first observed in rodents navigating a maze. And so what we know from this literature is that there's cells in your brain that respond when you're in a particular location. So there's cells for location A, for location B, location C, location D. And what we find is that as a rat is navigating a maze, you will see that there are electric field fluctuations, in this example, in the hippocampus, a region of the brain really important for spatial navigation. And these electric field fluctuations are timed and locked to the activity of these place cells signaling different locations in a maze. So what this looks like is as this big electric field is occurring, you have a sequential activation of neurons, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, B, C, D, E. And this is a form of cross-frequency coupling where once you witness this activity, you can then decode the position of the animal in the maze simply from this more macroscopic electric field that you can observe in the hippocampus in this example. So one of the most common forms of cross-frequency coupling that we observe in the brain is phase-amplitude coupling, where the phase of this low-frequency signal is locked to activity of a higher frequency at a smaller structure. All right, just like I showed in that previous example, we can build causal evidence for cross-frequency coupling. So one such method is through electrical stimulation. So you hook up a participant in a lab to this stimulation device, and you deliver electric current that is designed to mimic the cross-frequency coupling pattern that we observe as people are doing various cognitive tasks. So for example, we can record some coupling activity during this task. We generate an electric waveform, and then we deliver stimulation to the participant as they're performing a task. And what we find is that we can increase the cross-frequency coupling that we observe, in this case with EEG, and then we'll also change cognition in those tasks where that cross-frequency coupling is recruited. So what does this all mean for consciousness and hierarchical consciousness? Well, my obsession with cross-frequency coupling has really driven me to dive deeply into what this would mean for our conscious experience. So what if we take cross-frequency coupling very, very seriously and we project our experience into what we're observing in neural activity as people are doing complex cognitive tasks? So essentially what we propose in our paper is that there are cognitive processes going on at all of these different scales. And if you view neural activity at one of these more macroscopic scales, the content within that scale will be populated by the lower scales. So we use the metaphor of a mosaic tile. This is an image that is made out of tiles. And here, the mosaic image is that more macro system, and the tiles are the individual subcomponents of that system. And furthermore, we propose that this is recursively nested one within another, where the tile of the mosaic image is itself a mosaic tiling of even smaller subcomponents at an even smaller level. So we propose that this nested observer windows model, where we say that you are some sort of apex observer window, some sort of process happening at this very grand, large scale in the brain, and nested within your experience is many different cognitive processes, all computing and processing their own sort of vantage point of your experience, and then that same arrangement is projected into recursively smaller systems. So in order to flesh out this model fully, we employ 3 different metaphors. The first one I've described to you is mosaic tiling. The second one is that there are these spatio-temporal bounded functional units inside of your brain, and these act as a theater of experience where all these different cognitive processes come together and get bound into a single gestalt experience, which we call a observer window. And then finally, we propose that within any given spatiotemporal level, you'll have multiple observer windows, and there's a means by which they are able to communicate with each other. So for each of these metaphors, we propose a mechanism motivated by evidence from cognitive neuroscience and backed up by non-invasive brain stimulation. The first one I've already described to you, which is cross-frequency coupling. We propose that this is a mechanism by which information will emerge from smaller systems into more macroscopic systems. But you can also have the reverse influence where a more macro system will submergently project control signals down into more microscopic systems. We define an observer window as having a high degree of synchrony. Synchrony is zero phase lag, meaning that all of the units within the system are so tightly coupled with each other that they essentially fuse and are undifferentiated and become a single system. This is similar to the proposal of binding by synchrony by Wolf Singer in the 80s. And within your brain, there'll be many different observer windows, each processing their own sort of mode of cognition. And then if you look within a single level of analysis within the brain, there's a mechanism by which these different observer windows can communicate with each other. We propose coherence, which is a positive non-zero phase lag, where you have two systems that are temporally aligning their activity in order to transmit information between them. And this is similar to the proposal of communication through coherence by Pascal Fries. So here I'm depicting a similar scenario to what I started my presentation with sort of an abstract cognitive window thinking about the nature of consciousness, and another part of your brain driving the car that you are flying down the freeway in. And there's sort of a mechanism of sending interrupt signals between these different systems to share information. So you might be wondering, is this a sufficient mechanism to generate consciousness? If I were to implement these in a chip in some way, would consciousness pop out here? We report that these are three different mechanisms that can be employed in psychology experiments, in neuroscience studies, and there's plenty of evidence to back up the existence of these signals. However, we are staying agnostic to the idea that these signals are sufficient for generating consciousness in and of itself. We think these signals are at the very least necessary for consciousness. However, they may not be sufficient in themselves to generate consciousness on their own. Although there are many people out there, for example, Tam Hunt and Jonathan Schooler, considering maybe electromagnetic fields as a substrate for consciousness. All right, so what does this mean for you, an apex observer window within a nested hierarchical observer window system? Well, life at the apex is very abstract. So you live your life and ideas are constantly popping into your head. So I give the example of Goofy here with the light bulb going on. This is an emergent process where sub-windows have processed and generated some information, and you receive these fully formed gestalt information signals from the lower levels. Furthermore, as you navigate the world around you, you are also operating, once again, at a very abstract level. You have a cartoon action plan of what you want to do. I need to run to the other side of the tennis court and swing my racket to hit the ball, judging the trajectory of motion of the ball. And you enact this very cartoony action plan from the apex, and then it submerges down into your body and gets processed with more details. So this is a little bit of having your cake and eating it too, where your conscious experience is rich with all this content, all this detailed information from these lower windows, and yet you're not burdened by that level of detail. Similarly, you can do very complex actions with your body, and yet you don't need to be aware of all of the musculature that needs to be activated to make that action occur. So the nested observer windows model kind of accounts for that separation of you from these lower levels. So you do not have full control over your nested observer windows, and one of the kind of curious things about this model is that we suggest that these lower order cognitive systems are semi-autonomous to some degree, where you have influence over them, but you are not in complete control over your own cognitive structures at this lower order. So one very simple example is an optical illusion. So you should see this image is kind of twisting and spiraling. Even though you have knowledge that this optical illusion is false and doesn't represent reality around you, you can't help but see the optical illusion because you're not in control of your own visual system. This is a lower order observer window that is processing this optical illusion, and try as you might, your top-down submergence of control signals can't breach the autonomy of these lower levels. There's evidence to suggest with this rat example where you're taking place cells, you're building more abstract representations from simpler components. So there's a buildup of abstraction as you move up the observer window hierarchy. And a lot of work in my lab is actually really looking at how goals are translated into actions. And we are finding that there's these distributed networks of brain regions that process goal information, and this gets mapped down into the motor cortex via cross-frequency coupling when it comes time to make a decision and move your body. All right, some other curious implications of the now model is that the apex is very slow, and so your mind is extremely slow. And I think this is a little bit counterintuitive. But if we look evolutionarily, this seems to be consistent. We have, for example, you trying to swat a fly, and the fly is very quickly and easily able to dodge your hand as you swing through the air. If you watch a fly, it appears to be teleporting, right? So why would evolution select for these big, slow, lumbering giants that we are? Why wouldn't we just become faster and faster and more reflex-driven? Right? To escape predation, you think it would be best to be very, very, very fast. However, the nested observer windows model would suggest that evolution is building nested systems on top of older evolutionary architecture, and that by creating bigger, slower creatures, this is one of the primary ways that we are gaining higher levels of intelligence and, able to process information at these higher levels of abstraction. So we propose that the apex is at least 1 hertz, maybe slower. This is 1 time per second. And this is some way that we can account for our ability to integrate over the many eye movements that we're making at all times, to integrate over the many phonemes that I'm throwing at you through the airwaves to create full sentences in your perception. And there's a few other people like Marcus Rakel, B.U. Hay, George Northoff that have also been speculating that maybe consciousness is a little bit slower than we might have taken for granted. Another interesting implication is that the brain is intentionally very modular. And so could it be that the brain, to survive, has kind of designed itself to create as much conflicting opinions within you as possible? So instead of coming from this assumption that everything needs to build one single location where everything makes perfect sense, the brain might be incentivized to build different conflicting opinions internally, and this could explain why a lot of our inner mental life is very chaotic, and we have many different thoughts and feelings and ways that we want to act and be. And so we're here at the apex trying to mediate across all these very, very different personalities and expressions of who we are. And I think one big example of this is that our brain is literally chopped in half, where there's a white matter bundle connecting the 2 hemispheres. But if you would think that if the goal of the brain is to be this very singular place, why would you chop the brain into two massively disconnected hemispheres, right? The Now model can also comment on a few curious findings from the field. One of them is split brain patients. These are individuals that have received surgery to stop their epilepsy. And what they do is they actually sever the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. And we've all seen these or many of us have seen these very simple tasks where you show something in the left visual field and the right visual field, and that information will be processed differently. However, people that have actually worked with these patients, and while writing this paper, we actually talked with some of these researchers, in the very first years after your brain is severed into two hemispheres, there's these very curious coexistence of what seems to be two very different personalities with different beliefs, different goals, and there's even conflict between the limbs in some more extreme scenarios. About a year or so after the surgery, the right hemisphere appears to just go dormant and become subservient to the left hemisphere for whatever reason. So a major question here is, are there two people in this person's brain? Could this be something like severing the apex observer window into two distinct individuals? On the flip side, there's a couple cases of expanding the sort of typical neural architecture. One of them is Krista and Tatiana Hogan, who are conjoined by the brain, and they have a thalamic bridge which neurally links their two thalamus or thalami. And there's a lot of really interesting behaviors that these girls are able to exhibit. They're able to relinquish control of their bodies to each other. They're able to communicate with just thinking at each other and tell jokes and hold entire conversations internally. And so a question is, are these two girls different people? And we would suggest that yes, they are. Their parents report that they maintain very different personalities from each other. And at first pass, we might think, wow, this is so foreign to my own experience. I could never imagine living my life in this manner. But in the nested observer windows model, it could be that you already are experiencing to some degree the same level of having many different cognitive processes all interacting with each other. And when you tell yourself a funny joke and you're sitting alone in your room and you start laughing because you thought something funny, is that somehow equivalent to the hemispheres communicating, and is this as quote-unquote bizarre as you might think at first pass? There's some other people that can comment on this. Richard Schwartz is a family therapist, he developed what's called, he was doing a lot of family psychotherapy, and what he realized was that he could take his family-based psychotherapy techniques and apply them to the individual. And so this is what he calls the internal family systems model, where essentially within an individual, there's many different personalities and different desires and drives competing for expression in our lives. And he found that the same techniques in family therapy work individually. And so we might think, oh, this is just a fun thought play that we're doing to just kind of, do some role playing internally. But could it be that a lot of cognitive dissonance or psychiatric illness could arise from some sort of discoherence between the many different drives within us? And this could be operationalized as some sort of conflict between observer windows nested within the apex, which is you. In more extreme scenarios, we have things like dissociative identity disorder. This is colloquially known as multiple personality disorder. And when I first started receiving some training in clinical psychology, I brought this up to my mentors, and they told me, this is just fanciful, and this isn't real, and this was made by the movies to sell movie tickets, and you need to forget about this. So strangely, this is, even in its phenomenology, has been sort of a controversial thing to even suggest is happening in people. However, there's a lot of great review articles trying to validate and suggest that this truly is happening. And I now have secondhand knowledge of, some psychiatrist friends of mine who have witnessed this firsthand on multiple scenarios. But what is it that makes this so frightening to us personally? I think that we exist within kind of a cultural landscape which is, fearful of this idea that there could be multiple personalities within us, and there's no sort of neurological framework to explain something like this, and so we kind of reject it in its, even as occurring. However, in the now model, there's sub-windows nested within your apex consciousness, and so something like this might not be so pathological as we might, expect at first pass. And I think this really relates well to what Tanya Luhrmann was talking about in the talk previously. This is also in reference to some of Tanya Luhrmann's work, but there's this growing phenomenon on Reddit in particular of tulpas and tulpamancy, and this is essentially the intentional creation of an imaginary friend inside of your mind, and these individuals will practice effortfully creating this inner voice, this inner person that they can talk to. And so one question that we have kind of intellectually is, are tulpas real? Does this represent some real neurobiological phenomenon? And in the now model, we would expect that something like this could be possible and would be possible. Culturally, we've kind of wiped out these experiences, but I've talked with many people, even one person at this conference yesterday, about having very vivid childhood friendships that they experienced until pretty late in their childhood. There's also some very weird organisms which might differ from the human physiology and might give us a unique perspective into the now model in different organisms. One of them is the octopus, which exhibits semi-autonomous activity within each of its tentacles. And it appears that, yes, there is some sort of apex goal-directed behavior within the octopus. They're highly intelligent. And yet there seems to be a more accentuated level of autonomy at the sub-window level when it comes to the tentacles, which seem to learn and behave somewhat more autonomously than maybe your arm or your leg. But potentially we could introspect and realize that maybe our limbs are a little more aware than we think. There's also people like Michael Levin, who is interested in a lot of these hierarchical models of consciousness, and he's created these super bizarre little cell clumps. I think these are actually out of human cells, and if you clump these cells together, they will actually start spontaneously behaving, seeking out food, fighting each other. And so could there be these kind of like rudimentary biological systems where we might see the early emergence of cross-frequency coupling between a macro multicellular system and the single cellular level of the body of that individual? All right, so an important question that arises from this line of research is, where is your consciousness? All right, so we would propose that there's an apex observer window, and that is the person I'm talking to primarily right now. This is your apex hierarchical consciousness model. But we're open but agnostic to the possibility that there might be sub-windows within you which might have their own independent conscious experience. And I know this is a bit of a wild idea, but worth investigating potentially. And so we propose that maybe there's a emergent hierarchical consciousness where above some level of complexity of some kind, you have conscious observer windows above that threshold. And then, of course, there is the panpsychic hierarchical consciousness model, where it's, conscious beings all the way down through your physiology. However, we, speculate that you still need some sort of infrastructure to encapsulate that spatial temporal boundary, which creates an observer window. So this may not happen spontaneously, out in space, but who knows? Relationship to other models. So the higher order thought model, I think, is very akin to this idea of hierarchical scaling. So in higher order thought, the kind of key element of consciousness is thinking about thinking about thinking. And we think that, through this hierarchical integration process, this is a very natural way of building thoughts about thoughts. When we relate our work to, let's say, the global neuronal workspace model, they propose that there's some sort of, we would call it an observer window, some sort of global workspace where through high synchrony, all of this information is being integrated and bound together. And then finally, you have models like the integrated information theory by Tononi, where this one really posits that it's the connectivity between different functional units, in our case, observer windows, and that complexity of interaction is really key. So here we can see the cross-frequency coupling, the synchrony, the coherence. Each of the metaphors at play and each of the mechanisms at play in our model seem to be consistent to at least a first degree with these existing theories. An important differentiation is that in our theory, this is happening at a multi-scalar level, whereas a lot of the sort of neural theories of consciousness are just that. They're neurally based, and they propose that neurons are kind of the only functional unit at play. All right, in closing, I will pay reference to Daniel Dennett's idea of the Cartesian theater. So Daniel Dennett proposed that, if we think about consciousness as a little man in our head that's hearing the world and seeing the world and pulling all the levers and controlling our bodies, there's a massive problem with this framing where there must be an even smaller little man inside that little man's head pulling those strings and moving that little tiny body around. And there's an infinite regression of smaller and smaller beings inside of your head. And this was used as a rejection of the Cartesian theater. However, we kind of latch onto this somewhat in a kind of like playful, joking way, where we say, well, this is our solution, right? We propose that there is nested cognitive systems inside of you, and this is sort of a unique solution to some of consciousness's problems. And some open questions here are, is it turtles all the way down, or is there some plateau? And could there be anything bigger than us beyond the individual? So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and especially to Jonathan Schooler for the collaboration here.
Thank you, Justin. We have time for 2 quick questions. Let's take one from each side of the room. Go ahead over here.
Hi. Mine's kind of a statement, but it might be a question. I study plasma. I feel like what you did is like brilliant because in my view, which links up with yours, it's just a different language, it feels like you've discovered how our brain makes a plasma field and connects with the bigger plasma field, which consciousness feeds back with. So in my mind, the windows are all made out of plasma, and it's holding consciousness, which holds an EM field. And the brain is more like a torus, which also could be plasma, because plasma is toroidal. And it would also, I equate the Akashic field to plasma, which would make sense why we get ideas from this field, but maybe it's not conscious, but it holds the framework for consciousness. So I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, thanks so much. I also have just like loved the concept of plasmas and studied like, I think David Bohm talks about like the plasma acting like an organism. I wonder what the synchrony or like what draws that boundary around an observer window. Potentially it's as simple as just having high synchronization among the units. But yeah, I think plasma phenomenon are quite bizarre. And I'm very open-minded to ideas like orchestrated objective reduction where, there's kind of a harder boundary of like, quantum coherence is kind of the strong boundary of what would encapsulate and create one of these, functional units. So, I stay agnostic to the mechanism at this stage. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just fun to talk about.
Yeah, I agree.
Justin, great talk, great clarity. Thank you. And thank you for the slide on tennis.
That was for you, Mark, yeah.
I appreciate that. So with respect to that, my concern is about the hierarchy of the nested, the resonance. And I'm saying this with respect to the experiential domain and referencing Penrose, who argues that for conscious processing of the now, he's pointing to processes at the quantum molecular domain. And so if we strip the hierarchy out of that, and certainly this is consistent with tennis, when the brain, you're in the flow state, your brain is actually quiet. When you're learning it, it seems to be a classical system. But So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, there's a lot to riff off there. But yeah, we actually talk about in the paper a little bit about the flow state as maybe the apex, kind of taking the brakes off of the sub windows and allowing the autonomy of your body to kind of take over and go through those motions. And I think there's some evidence that, I remember seeing an example where even playing tennis, you're supposed to like occupy your mind with some sort of song and then allow your body just to like go through the motions. And there's probably a flip where it really is important to think carefully about what's happening and exert, as much top-down control as you possibly can. But yeah, all of that is kind of adjacent to the Penrose comment.
Well, the Penrose comment is the idea that the control actually at that level in the high performance state or in meditation is actually is actually permeating from the fine scale up, and hence you get the backward propagation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
So I think if you strip hierarchy out of there, it might be something. It might be a recursive system that builds itself, maybe from the top down, and then, then when it goes to performance, something else happens.
Yeah, I think it's definitely tricky because if you take kind of the hard microtubule approach, right, there's really one substrate of where consciousness is occurring. And so the question of, how do we have such a slow macro experience where I'm thinking a thought and it takes 3 or 4 seconds, if all these quantum processes are happening super quickly at the scale of megahertz, where then does this more macro scale kick in? Because it feels like we're quite slow, Yeah, so it could be some sort of emergent interference of these smaller systems. Or maybe the brain has built multiple systems that have different time scales and then allows them to interact, which I've been playing around with. But yeah, when it comes to mechanism, we're going for we could do some psychology experiments on this immediately. And then mechanism probably will take some more time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, our final speaker for the session is George Mashour, professor he's the Burt Ladue Professor of Anesthesiology at the University of Michigan, also one of the main sponsors of the conference, and we're very much appreciative of that. His research focuses on neuroscientific foundations of consciousness and the mechanisms underlying anesthetic-induced unconsciousness. Take it away, George.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my talk up here. I think I'm going to need some help because the cursor doesn't seem to be functioning properly. So while you're doing that, I just want to express my enthusiasm and excitement to be here. I always enjoy being in Tucson, but it's especially meaningful given the 30th anniversary celebration. I'm just going to keep talking. We'll see what happens. So let me start setting the stage and the framework for my lecture. There are lots of debates and controversies in our field, but one thing that I think that we can generally agree upon is that there are 2 unique classes of drugs that have really been essential for the study of consciousness: anesthetics and psychedelics. Anesthetics help us modulate the global state of arousal, which gives us insight into the neurobiology of the level of consciousness. Psychedelics help us modulate the qualitative aspects of experience, giving us insight into the content of consciousness. And traditionally, the investigation of anesthetics and psychedelics has been independent. Also the case for level and content of consciousness. But more recently, a number of studies and articles have integrated data sets related to both anesthetics and psychedelics. I think what has been relatively underexplored is how these 2 classes of drugs interact. And what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully with the use of slides, is going to be exploring the interfaces of the anesthetized state and psychedelics. So how are we doing here, folks? Okay. Yep, I will keep going. So let's think about these mirror images of the anesthetized state and the psychedelic state from the neurobiological perspective. Anesthetics reduce neurophysiologic complexity, often used as an experimental surrogate for differentiated information processing. They also reduce between-network functional connectivity, which is used as an experimental surrogate for integration. They constrain the repertoire of accessible brain states. And they also move the brain away from criticality, that dynamic state at the boundary of order and disorder, which maximizes flexibility and optimizes information processing. And I think it's plausible to suggest that all of these different properties of the anesthetic is what accounts for the fact that the capacity for experience is reduced in the anesthetized state. That's why we use them. Now, on the other side, thinking about psychedelics, they increase neurophysiologic complexity. They enhance between-network connectivity. They expand the repertoire of accessible brain states. They move the brain closer to criticality. And again, using a parallel logic, I think it's plausible to suggest that these various features contribute to what we might consider an enrichment of our conscious experience. So the question is, how do these two interact? And can we leverage the mirror images of the anesthetized state and the psychedelic state to accomplish different states of consciousness? So the goal for these particular studies was to use psychedelics to try to accelerate recovery from anesthesia or actively reverse the anesthetized state. And there are two studies that I want to describe for you. The first one is with the anesthetic isoflurane. It's a halogenated ether that's in common clinical use. These are rodent studies, and hopefully I'll have a chance to show you the video. I hope I don't have to act it out on the stage. So we give isoflurane, and then we use ketamine at sub-anesthetic concentrations. Now, ketamine was initially developed as an analog to PCP, as an anesthetic that had reduced deliriogenic effects compared to PCP, but at sub-anesthetic doses, it has psychedelic properties. So, first experiment, first study, isoflurane, and then giving ketamine. The second study is isoflurane or propofol, a commonly used intravenous anesthetic. And what we use in that study from the psychedelic perspective, I don't need these slides. I'm rolling here, Stuart. Thank you. Oh, I'm fine, thanks. You're lucky you didn't hear what many of my nested selves were saying during those past 5 minutes. I kept it at the apex, people. So this just summarizes what I've already described, but actually one thing I do want to bring up in the spirit of this session and some of what we heard about earlier is that despite the fact that anesthetics and psychedelics really have these mirror image qualities, you know, these states are journeys, and in the therapeutic setting, they can be dangerous journeys, and they require a guide. And I just wanted to suggest that I think anesthesiologists and also those who help guide people during psychedelic psychotherapy are part of a common and ancient tradition of the psychopomps. And psychopomp is translated as a chaperone of the soul. And you see this across antiquity because the ancients recognized that these transitions and these boundaries could be dangerous, and they required a guide. So just going clockwise, you have Hermes from Greek mythology, Anubis from Egyptian mythology, Sholop from Aztec mythology, the Valkyries from Nordic philosophy and mythology, and also Oya from the Yoruba mythology of Africa. Now, primarily, these psychopomps would help people journey from the land of the living to the land of the dead. But this term was reintroduced by Carl Jung in the context of psychoanalysis, and I would suggest that anesthesiologists and those psychotherapists and support individuals in psychedelic journeys really are part of this tradition. Okay, so now, again, asking the question, can the mirror image effects of psychedelics accelerate recovery from anesthesia or even actively reverse the anesthetized state? Another way of thinking about this, since we have lots of dialogue about physics here, it's like antimatter. You know, can we set up a collision between the anesthetized state and the psychedelic state so that the output is essentially a neutralized waking consciousness? And I've already described some of this. So the first study, which has been published with isoflurane and ketamine, and I'm going to talk about ketamine in a moment, just to emphasize that it really does have psychedelic properties. And what I was about to describe was another study that's unpublished that I'll share with you with isoflurane or propofol, and the psychedelic is DOI, dimethoxyiodoamphetamine. Now, you might hear the word amphetamine and think, well, wait a second, is this speed? Of course that's going to help somebody wake up. But this is a substituted amphetamine that doesn't have frank psychostimulant properties and is considered to be more of a classical serotonergic psychedelic. So this comes from a review from Alex Kwan and colleagues. And just to orient you to the drugs that we're talking about, there's DOI in the same class as mescaline, and then ketamine, which is classified as a dissociative. Now, the term dissociative actually originates from the 1960s to differentiate ketamine from other kinds of conventional anesthetics. There is some dialogue, I don't want to say controversy, that's a little bit too strong, in terms of whether or not ketamine is a psychedelic. And I would suggest that it is. You can consider it atypical or non-classical, but it induces psychedelic phenomenology, it enhances neurophysiologic complexity, it increases and expands the repertoire of accessible brain states, it enhances between network connectivity, it induces neuroplasticity, and it's an antidepressant with a single administration. So it really fits the criteria of a psychedelic. And I'll also point out a study that we published last year in Neuroimage, which is there are actually some common neural correlates across classical and non-classical psychedelics. That cluster in this posterior cortical area, which is, as we've heard, might be critically important for the content of consciousness. And it also has some common, or induces some common connectivity patterns with the temporoparietal junction. So all of this to say that I think it's legitimate to consider ketamine as a psychedelic when it's delivered at sub-anesthetic doses. Now, I also want to go back to the slide just with a disclaimer that I am going to be showing you 3 videos that involve rats that are instrumented with EEG and microdialysis catheters. I know that there are a diversity of perspectives in terms of animal research, and I just wanted to highlight that so that if anybody is uncomfortable with that, I will not be offended. If you get up and leave, I'll be happy to talk to you about the experiments later. Okay, so first experiment, assessing the effects of ketamine on an isoflurane anesthetic. 10 rats, and ketamine was given at sub-anesthetic doses in the middle of an isoflurane anesthetic. And you see 1 MAC, that stands for minimum alveolar concentration. I won't get into the details of what that is, but suffice it to say, it's a standard pharmacologic dosimetric, dates back to the 1960s, and this is a clinically relevant concentration. We also had intracranial EEG, 6 channels, frontal, parietal, and occipital bilaterally, and also a microdialysis catheter. So this is like a very thin tube that goes into, in this case, the medial prefrontal cortex. And we use the EEG to assess basic spectral features, undirected functional connectivity, coherence, and we've heard a little bit about that, and also directed functional connectivity, which we use as a kind of surrogate for communication across different brain regions. Now, before I show you the data, I wanted to just provide the conceptual framework of why I designed this experiment. If you think about an ether anesthetic, it is, in some regards, very much like non-REM sleep. You can see slow waves. It reduces cortical acetylcholine, and of course it reduces the capacity for consciousness. Again, that's why we use it. But unlike our sleep patterns, when someone is under isoflurane, they never kick in to some other state, like REM sleep, which is associated with an active cortex, increased acetylcholine, sometimes even beyond the levels of wakefulness, and also the capacity for vivid phenomenology in the form of dreams. So I was asking myself the question, how can we make a conventional anesthetic more sleep-like by introducing something that might enhance cortical activation, increase acetylcholine, maybe even increase the chances of a REM-like state. And ketamine fits that bill. Because when you give ketamine, you induce gamma oscillations, you increase cortical acetylcholine, even at anesthetic levels, which is distinct from other anesthetics, and you can induce disconnected states of consciousness, dreamlike states, even during an anesthetic. So more than 80% of ketamine-based anesthetics are associated with dream states. So I thought we're going to have this non-REM-like slow wave state of isoflurane, and then I'm going to give ketamine, and then we're going to see some cortical activation and increase acetylcholine, and it's going to be REM-like, and the animals are going to wake up faster. And I was wrong. What happened instead, when we gave the ketamine, is that burst suppression was enhanced. And burst suppression is an EEG feature of supratherapeutic anesthesia. It's excessively deep. You don't need it in order to anesthetize someone. So before I break down this graph, I'll just show you what burst suppression looks like. This is actually from a picture I took in the operating room. I'm a neuroscientist, but I'm also a clinical anesthesiologist. I was in the OR. I work primarily in neurosurgical cases where there's neurophysiologic monitoring. And you can see a really classic clinical example of burst suppression where you have essentially electrical quiescence that is punctuated by higher frequency, higher amplitude activity, and then you see quiescence afterward. And the longer that period of quiescence, the higher the suppression ratio. So now let's go back to the graph. Each point on the x-axis is during isoflurane. The first one is before ketamine was given, and the subsequent ones were after ketamine. And we're comparing ketamine and saline. Ketamine is in the red, saline is in the blue, and that will carry forward for the next few slides. So upon reflection, I said, well, yeah, of course. You know, I'm giving another anesthetic on top of an anesthetic, even though it's at sub-anesthetic doses. And looking into the literature, so ketamine has NMDA antagonist effects. In the animal literature, when you deliver MK801, which is an NMDA antagonist, during an isoflurane anesthetic, you get burst suppression, so very consistent. But I was only half wrong. So even though the addition of ketamine at psychedelic doses deepen the anesthetic, it actually accelerated the recovery. So once the isoflurane was discontinued, we dial it down to 0, you can see that the ketamine-treated group recovered faster by about 45%. And you can also see that the variability in emergence times was dramatically reduced. So this is paradoxical. In fact, we call this paradoxical emergence, because if you have an anesthetic and you are adding a psychoactive drug, you would expect either for the anesthetic to deepen and the recovery time to be extended, a prolonged recovery, or the anesthetic is going to get lightened and you're going to have a faster recovery. But in this case, they went deeper, but they accelerated the recovery process. So why might that be happening? Well, this is where the EEG and the neurochemistry can help us have some insight. So what we found in a follow-up study is that in the ketamine-treated group, there was an increase in directed connectivity in the feed forward, back to front, and feedback directions. So that vertical line in the middle is the time of emergence, and we tried to align this to normalize it so we can look at the slope of directed connectivity, and you can see the lines in red, again, the ketamine-treated group, having a sharper rise as emergence approaches compared to those treated with saline, and you can see the quantification of that slope to the right. So accelerated recovery due to the administration of psychedelic doses of ketamine enhanced cortical communication, or at least a surrogate of cortical communication, and it also enhanced acetylcholine in the cortex. So here's the waking state, they're tracking together. Cortical acetylcholine drops during isoflurane, as I already mentioned, but even after the ketamine injection, the cortical acetylcholine didn't go up as I expected. However, once the isoflurane was discontinued, you can see that there is a sharp rise in acetylcholine in the prefrontal cortex in the ketamine-treated group compared to the saline-treated group. So who cares? What does this mean? There are probably lots of neurochemical perturbations in lots of different cortical areas. So is there any causal relevance or mechanistic connection between increasing acetylcholine in the prefrontal cortex and accelerating the emergence of consciousness? And in fact, there is. So this was a separate study published in Current Biology in 2018, in which we used microdialysis catheters either in the prefrontal cortex or different areas of the parietal cortex, sensory and association cortex. We reverse dialyzed in carbachol, which is a mixed cholinergic agonist. So it's ramping up the cholinergic system in the areas in which it is being delivered. And this is what we found. So I'm going to every time I think we're going south, it comes back. So the animal on the left has the dialysis catheter in the prefrontal cortex. The one in the right has it in posterior parietal cortex. You can see the EEG tracing. The blue is from the frontal lead. The green is from the parietal lead. And the first thing that you're going to appreciate is that the EEG gets activated. And it doesn't matter where you're stimulating. Both of the leads get activated. And you see a shift from the larger amplitude, lower frequency waveform to a smaller amplitude, higher frequency waveform that's more consistent with waking consciousness. You can actually appreciate some epileptiform activity in that green lead in the parietal cortex on the right side. So what also is happening is respiration increase. Are you able to appreciate that? Can you see that the the respiratory rate is increasing. There's clearly some top-down communication from the cortex to the brainstem. But now let's jump ahead to what we're interested in here. You can see the animal, and this is consistent across the study, the animals that had stimulation in the prefrontal cortex tended to be aroused and, in fact, wake up from the anesthetic. So how do we know they're awake? Well, they're moving, but they're also righting themselves. So rats do not like to be on their back. They're exposed. They always try to get on all fours. And when they lose that ability, we consider it a surrogate for unconsciousness, and the recovery a surrogate for the return of consciousness. So let's jump ahead here just a little bit. And you can see the rat on the left is looking fairly normal, despite the fact that it is still breathing clinically relevant concentrations of anesthesia, enough to keep somebody unconscious during surgery. Okay, so what is going on? Well, we did another set of experiments where instead of activating these regions, we pharmacologically lesion them with tetrodotoxin, which is a sodium channel blocker. And what we found is that only the groups lesioned in the medial prefrontal cortex, not the parietal areas, had a delay in the recovery of consciousness. And so what we would suggest, based on these data and other data that we gathered, is that the medial prefrontal cortex is a key node in arousal circuitry that is controlling level of consciousness. Now, I want to make a distinction here between the current controversies, which typically focus on lateral prefrontal cortex and content of consciousness. I'm talking about medial prefrontal cortex and level of consciousness. And there is a strong neuroanatomic argument for the prefrontal cortex to be important for arousal. First of all, if you believe in a neurocognitive hierarchy, and if you believe that the prefrontal cortex is at the apex of that hierarchy, it can't simply be subject to the whim and whimsy of subcortical structures telling the organism to go to sleep. There's got to be some sort of top-down control, and in fact, the neuroanatomy would support it. So in addition to connectivity with the thalamus, with the pontine reticular formation, you see this rich interconnection with key arousal centers, such as the serotonergic dorsal raphe, the noradrenergic locus coeruleus, the cholinergic system of the basal forebrain, and also the dopaminergic ventral tegmental area, which we heard about from Dr. Vincent on Monday. And this slide is a great segue into the next experiment, because not only does the dorsal raphe project to the PFC, but the medial PFC has one of the highest concentrations of 5-HT2 receptors, which are thought to be the molecular targets and mediators of the psychedelic experience. And so that leads us into this next experiment, which isn't just about accelerating recovery, but the active reversal of the anesthetized state. So the animals have high density EEG that's going to enable us more sophisticated analysis. They're in the baseline waking state. They then receive either propofol intravenously or the inhaled anesthetic isoflurane. They're in the anesthetized state for 40 minutes. And then they get an intravenous bolus of either saline, the control, or DOI, which again is that serotonergic psychedelic. The anesthetic's then discontinued, and then there's a recovery period. So let's see what happens here in terms of the arousal response. So you have the animal getting propofol on the left, the one getting isoflurane on the right. And then there is a bolus of DOI, and you can appreciate that the animal on the right, receiving, again, clinically relevant anesthetic that we would be using in the operating room for surgery, is starting to wake up a bit and look around after that bolus of DOI. Now there's some kind of twitch muscular activity going on with the animal, but after that DOI bolus is in, even the animal getting the propofol infusion starts to wake up move around and turn over. Okay, now, you've heard a bit about coherence from Dr. Riddle. What I'm showing you now in 2 panels are coherograms. And what I want to emphasize is that not only does DOI create this behavioral recovery, but there's also an increase in coherence, a reversal of decoherence that's happening during the anesthetic due to the administration of the psychedelic. So let me break this down for you. Focus on the top panel first. On the x-axis is time. The y-axis is the frequency, so in hertz, cycles per second. And then the color, the heat map, is representing the degree of coherence. And coherence is the statistical covariation of the activities of 2 brain regions. So the warmer colors in red and orange, higher coherence, cooler colors in blue, reduced coherence. So you can see that once the propofol is given, kind of in the middle of the screen at the top, it all turns blue. As I said earlier, anesthetics have consistently been shown to reduce functional connectivity and coherence. But once the bolus of the DOI goes in up top, you can see that there is a return, even an enhancement, of coherence in higher frequency oscillations that persists and then moves into the recovery period. Now, what's also interesting is if you look at the bottom panel is a coherogram in an animal that was pre-treated with volananserin, which is a 5-HT2 blocker. And when these animals are pre-treated with the 5-HT2 blocker, they do not wake up during the anesthetic. And as you can see here, they do not have a return of coherence. It is not until the anesthetic is discontinued, over in the far right of the lower panel, that you see that heat map heating up again with cortical coherence. And you see something very similar with isoflurane. The top panel is without pretreatment with volananserin, the bottom with. And again, there is both a suppression by blocking 5-HT2, a suppression of the behavioral response as well as the neurophysiological response. Now that was undirected connectivity. I'm going to get back to what I showed you earlier in terms of that feedback and feed forward, although this is focused on feedback connectivity. And you can see that after propofol or isoflurane is administered, there's a drop in that feedback connectivity that then goes back up again when DOI is administered. So we are showing that there's not only a behavioral recovery, there's both undirected and directed functional connectivity that is returning in association with the administration of DOI. Okay, so it seems to be 5-HT2 mediated, but lots of different drugs can affect serotonin receptors. Is this specific to the psychedelic? I don't have a full answer, but what we have shown in preliminary data is that if you, in this case, anesthetize the animal with propofol and then administer lyseride, which is a structural analog to LSD and acts at serotonin receptors, as well as others, you do not see a response. You see some twitching, but you do not see the animal really get aroused or turn over or recover. So it appears that there is something specific to the psychedelic drug. So to summarize, psychedelic doses of ketamine can deepen ether anesthesia but accelerate recovery. The serotonergic psychedelic DOI can not just accelerate recovery, but actively reverse the anesthetized state. Animals can wake up, coherence can return, despite the fact that they're still breathing or receiving clinically relevant concentrations of anesthesia. Ketamine and DOI both enhance functional connectivity, undirected and directed in the cortex. Now for ketamine, that only happens after the anesthetic is discontinued, but this classical psychedelic can do so even during the administration of an anesthetic. The behavioral and neurophysiological actions of DOI appear to be mediated by 5-HT2 receptors, but the non-psychedelic lyseride appears to be ineffective. It seems like there is something special about the psychedelic drug. And what I would suggest, based on these data, is that psychedelics should be explored as reversal agents for pharmacologic, but more importantly, I think, pathologic states of unconsciousness. Anesthesia is a great, reproducible, reliable model for pharmacological coma, but where I think this could really pay off is in thinking about individuals who have structural lesions who are in a pathologic state of unconsciousness, and we are starting to explore this in the laboratory setting with an animal model of coma. With that, I would like to thank the National Institutes of Health, which has supported my work for most of my faculty time. I want to thank the University of Michigan. I want to thank all of my colleagues at the Center for Consciousness Science. So this is a center I founded 10 years ago. Over the past 4 years, Dr. Tony Hudetz, who's to my right here in this picture, has been the director. And a number of people who were involved in these experiments are pictured here. Dinesh Pal, Vivian Hambrecht-Wiedbusch, Emma Hules, Duan Lee, and we have John Dean and other members who are here in the audience also pictured here. A wonderful group and a vibrant community. Also the Michigan Psychedelic Center, which I founded in 2022. We're building a wonderful cross-campus community. The medical school, College of Pharmacy, nursing, social work, the law school, the architecture school, the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Many people are coming together to have robust and rigorous discussions about psychedelics. And finally, I'd like to thank the organizers again for the kind invitation to speak. I want to thank you for your patience earlier in the talk, for your kind attention, and I'll be happy to address any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for that excellent talk. We are at the official end of the session. It sounds like you have time to stay and answer questions. Yes. Okay, so I'll let you decide how many questions you want to take. Before that, we did find a cell phone up here. I noticed that you rang for it with a lost phone signal. It's a purple iPhone. If you are looking for it, I have it. I'll turn it in at the registration desk, and I'll let you run the questions.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hammeroff, I can't imagine what you might be asking me about, but go ahead.
You know we're going to disagree, George. But first of all, great talks, great studies. Your work is amazing. I disagree with your interpretations, but okay. So as you know, I think all the anesthetics, the Fallon-Meyer-Overton, provide the unitary nature of anesthesia, additivity of MAC and so forth, indicate a common site of action, and that can only be microtubules because none of them, the gases all bind, or none of the membrane receptors don't bind to all anesthetics. So, and they bind to microtubules, very low intensity, but there's so many more tubulins, so the total amount. So if ether's acting on the microtubules and the ketamine is acting on the microtubules and the NMDA receptors, it's stimulating by the NMDA receptors and then being additive in terms of anesthesia at the microtubules. So at the end, when you turn off the ether, the ketamine at the NMDA receptor is still there activating, and isn't that effective at the microtubules. That would be my explanation for that. As far as the 5-HT2A, as we've learned recently, there are intraneuronal 5-HT2A receptors associated with the microtubules. So I think that could account for that also.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. So, yeah, I mean, there are different interpretations. I personally think what's going on in terms of the ketamine relates to NMDA binding. So when you give ketamine alone, ketamine has a preferential effect on GABAergic interneurons. So the NMDA receptors, so you've got pyramidal cells in the cortex, but they can't just be firing in an unconstrained manner. They need to have brakes, and those brakes are the GABAergic interneurons. So it's been shown, it's been demonstrated, including in prefrontal cortex, that NMDA antagonists will initially preferentially inhibit NMDA receptors on the interneuron, which basically disables the brakes, and that's why you get this higher frequency activity and potentially this phenomenology. I think what was happening here is you also have an NMDA antagonist effect by isoflurane. And so when you're adding even sub-anesthetic ketamine on board, there's just a ceiling effect. And it's not until the isoflurane is wearing off that you can start to see that NMDA-mediated effect of ketamine. So that's my interpretation. I do agree the recent data suggest that there might be intracellular targets for psychedelics, which I think is an exciting and interesting new direction. And as you suggested, psychedelics might bind to microtubules as well. So thank you. Thanks also for the invitation. And also thank you for pioneering this conference and for continuing it. You've built a really wonderful community, and I know we all are appreciative.
I just have to say one more thing. I remember you as a medical student in 1997 come to this conference. You were a psychiatry resident, or going into psychiatry. And then you went to ICU, then you went to anesthesia.
Yes.
I'm very proud of you as kind of...
Thank you. Thank you. And I do remember that. And also, Stuart took the time to talk to me. I was getting my PhD. I hadn't been in clinical medicine yet, and this was in the Elsinore conference. It was the first one I went to in '97. And he really inspired me, and I never, at that time, never imagined that I would end up being an anesthesiologist studying consciousness like Stuart. I also never imagined that I'd end up being as bald as Stuart. But anyway, sir.
Incredible research and talk. I really love mixing drugs for science. I think two quick things. So one is, have you mixed like ketamine and DOI? Because at least like talking to recreational users, like that sort of mixture is really synergistic. The other like kind of like a comment or maybe very slight pushback is DOI. It is quite stimulating. For people who have tried it, and I wonder, like, the most kind of like non-steam psychedelic I can think of is 2CC, which is also kind of relaxing. I wonder if that might be useful to experiment with.
Those are great points. The first one related to some mixology in terms of the psychedelics. That is something that can be explored in the future. Right now, we're just kind of testing the basic interactions, which I think has been really cool. But yes. Your second point is also a really good one, because a number of the psychedelics, I haven't had DOI, so I can't speak to it, but they actually do have an arousal promoting effect. Initially, we see this in animals, and it's probably true in people. I think that also gets back to the artificial distinction of, level of consciousness and content of consciousness. They're clearly intertwined. I think my main point for the audience was to say that even though the word amphetamine is in the name of DOI, that it's actually not considered an amphetamine or psychostimulant, but rather a classical psychedelic. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was mesmerizing. And I just want to ask, so you cranked up the conscious state from from anesthetized to normal awake state. Then would it be possible to crank consciousness down from psychedelic state to using anesthetics?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question. So just in terms of how you first describe things, I don't know exactly what the state is. I'm kind of thinking that they're sort of neutralizing each other, but clearly, the anesthesia is still on board. They're not just up running around. And yet also, some of the coherence in the higher frequency oscillations seem to be enriched even compared to the waking state. So the way that we're going to try to address this is not just by looking at behavioral, turning over, but rather cognitive testing. And we heard about this from Dr. Vincent on Monday, to try to get some insight into what might be going on. So that's the first thing. To your next question, yes, I think it'd be very interesting to have the animal or a human, preferably, in a psychedelic state, and then to gently titrate in the anesthetic to see if we can not make them unconscious, but rather return them to an ordinary state of consciousness. So yes, I think that is definitely something that could be explored. And I think we could test it in animals, where we obviously don't have the behavioral report, maybe looking at a surrogate neurophysiologic measure like complexity, which in humans does track with the psychedelic experience, but what you can also see increased in animals. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks. This question is related to a previous one. I think early on your contention was that anesthetics and psychedelics have opposing effects on complexity, both mental and physiological, and that might mediate this reversal. And so I'm curious about using stimulants that might not affect complexity, such as, I don't know, maybe caffeine or amphetamine. Is the prediction that those wouldn't be sufficient for the reversal, and is that true?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you asked that. Because there are a number of different ways that you can think about this reversal process, or trying to induce emergence and induce the recovery of consciousness. In terms of anesthesia, one approach might be just a classical pharmacologic antagonist, like flumazenil, which is going to block the GABAergic effects. Another approach might be the circuit level approach. And again, I've referred to Dr. Vincent's work, Dr. Solt's lab, but we heard about it on Monday, where you might be thinking about, well, what is, like in this case, the ventral tegmental area, can we hijack that with methylphenidate or something to try to address this at a circuit level? We've studied caffeine, actually. We have an ongoing NIH-funded clinical trial looking at caffeine at the end of an anesthetic to see if it improves consciousness and resolves delirium. So I think this, I don't know, but I think this is sort of a next level up in terms of more of a global state rather than a strict molecular level or strict isolated circuit level. So some of these drugs might not have an impact on complexity, but they might be playing a critical role in terms of overcoming the state by shifting the circuit activity in a systems neuroscience fashion. So. And then last question.
Hi. On a practical level, as an anesthesiologist, there's more and more people taking recreational psychedelics. So what kind of protocols do you have for people coming to you? Do you ask them, hey, when's the last time you've taken LSD, or do you microdose shrooms? And then how does that affect your dosaging, or how does that affect when they go in for surgery? Is there a certain amount of time to abstain before they go into surgery? Like practically, how do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is really not something that's out there in the clinical realm yet. And in fact, even pursuant to the last question, we do a bad job of just asking about caffeine, which is a widely used psychostimulant. We don't have a sense of how much people are using, or they're going to have some kind of withdrawal. So I think it is an important question. And I think certainly in areas where policies and laws are changing, like in Ann Arbor, it's not legal, but it's decriminalized. I think this will be important. Now, if anybody is coming into surgery tripping, boy, talk about a challenging experience. That's hardcore. But I do think, yeah, we will start to we have to be more mindful of this. And where this is also an issue, much more commonly, is in psychiatry. Because at the University of Michigan, we're federally funded. We have to abide by federal laws. We can't provide clinical services with serotonergic psychedelics, although we do have a ketamine clinic. But that dialogue is lacking. And some of my colleagues in the Michigan Psychedelic Center, in fact, some in this audience, are exploring the naturalistic use of psychedelics in the community and how that interfaces with medical care. And there's currently a big gap. So I think it's a great question and something that will need to be addressed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it, and look forward to chatting with you. Thank you.